The Galactic Summit was supposed to be a place of diplomacy, but Commander Darius Holt had never felt more out of place. He stood in the towering throne hall of the Zereth Dominion, a vast empire ruled by the strongest warrior race in the sector. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense and metal, and every Zereth noble in the room watched him with barely concealed disgust. At the center of it all sat Queen Selvera. She was 8 feet tall, her exoskeletal body gleaming under the crimson lights of the throne room. Her 4 arms rested elegantly on her throne, but there was no mistaking the power beneath them. Her piercing, golden eyes studied Holt like he was an insect beneath her boot. The sharp ridges along her skull-like crown flexed slightly as she smirked. So the humans wished to form an alliance through biological exchange. Her voice echoed through the hall, rich with mockery. Are you offering yourselves as breeding stock now? Laughter filled the chamber. Zereth warriors slammed their fists against their chests, their voices deep and guttural. They found the idea ridiculous. Humans were weak, short-lived, and fragile. To mix their genetics with the superior Zereth lineage was an insult to their queen's bloodline. Holt stood firm, meeting Selvera's gaze without fear. He had expected this reaction. The Zereth were powerful, but their pride blinded them. Humanity had faced stronger foes before and survived. He took a step forward, his voice steady. You misunderstand, Your Majesty, Holt said. We are not here to beg. Humanity stands as equals in this galaxy. If an alliance is to happen, it will be on both our terms. Selvera's smirk widened. Equals. She leaned forward, her black and silver carapace gleaming. Then prove it. She raised one of her 4 hands and pointed at her champion, General Korzhul. The massive warrior stepped forward, his exoskeleton thicker than armor plating, his razor-sharp tusks curving from his lower jaw. His deep purple war markings signified his victories in over 100 battles. If you humans are worthy, Selvera continued, defeat my champion in single combat. Do that, and I will consider your words. Another wave of laughter filled the throne room. Holt knew what they were thinking. A human, against a Zereth warlord. It would be a massacre. But Holt wasn't laughing. He simply nodded. I accept. A murmur of surprise ran through the chamber. Even Selvera tilted her head, intrigued. Bold. Or foolish, she mused. Either way, this will be entertaining. The throne room transformed into an arena within minutes. The nobles gathered around the edges, eager to witness the spectacle. Korzhul cracked his 4 knuckles, his serrated claws glinting. I will try not to break you too quickly, human. Holt rolled his shoulders, feeling the weight of 100 eyes on him. He wasn't stronger than Korzhul. He wasn't faster. But he was human, and humans always found a way. As the gong sounded, signaling the start of the fight, Holt didn't rush forward like the warrior expected. Instead, he analyzed, observed, and waited. Because brute strength wouldn't win this battle, cunning would. And if he had to make the entire Zereth Dominion see the truth about humanity, he would do it with his fists. The gong's echo faded, and for a moment, there was silence. Then General Korzhul lunged. The Zereth warlord was a mountain of muscle and exoskeletal armor, his 4 arms moving with terrifying speed. His clawed fists came crashing down, aiming to break Darius Holt in a single blow. But Holt was already moving. He dodged sideways, narrowly avoiding the strike as Korzhul's fists slammed into the arena floor, cracking the stone. The audience roared with excitement, expecting the fight to end quickly. Holt knew they didn't believe in him. Why would they? To the Zereth, strength was everything. And compared to them, Holt was small, fragile, weak. But strength wasn't just about power. It was about control. About knowing when to strike and when to move. Korzhul turned, snarling. Stop running, human. Face me. Holt didn't respond. He simply watched, his sharp blue eyes analyzing every movement. The Zereth were strong, but they were predictable. Korzhul fought like a battering ram. He relied on sheer force, on intimidation, on overwhelming power. Holt, on the other hand, fought like a human. The Zereth general attacked again, throwing a wild, crushing blow with his upper right fist. Holt ducked, letting the strike sail past his head. Before Korzul could recover, Holt stepped in close, slammed his elbow into a nerve point between the alien's ribs, then twisted away before the counterattack could land. Korzul stumbled, momentarily stunned. His golden eyes flashed with confusion. The crowd fell silent. No human had ever landed a hit on a Zereth warrior in single combat before. Queen Selvera, seated high on her throne, narrowed her eyes. She leaned forward, watching the fight with something more than amusement now. Interest. Korzul roared, in rage. His forearms lashed out in a flurry of strikes, faster than before. But now Holt saw the pattern. Every punch, every movement, it was all muscle memory, drilled into the general from years of war. Holt could break patterns. He twisted, dodged, and countered. He struck at weak points, the exposed joints of Korzul's exoskeleton, the sensitive nerves along his arms, the soft cartilage beneath his jaw. The Zereth general faltered. His powerful strikes were becoming slower, sloppier. The audience's laughter faded. Now they were silent, watching, doubting. Korzul snarled, panting. He charged forward in a final, reckless attack. Holt waited until the last second. Then, with a sudden, precise movement, he sidestepped, grabbed the warrior's arm, and used Korzul's own momentum against him. The Zereth general crashed onto the stone floor, landing hard on his back. The room erupted in shock. Holt didn't move. He didn't need to. Korzul was struggling to stand, his massive chest heaving, his limbs trembling. He had never been bested like this before. Queen Selvera's golden eyes locked onto Holt. For the first time in her life, a human had done the impossible. She rose from her throne, stepping down toward the arena. The nobles moved aside, clearing a path for their queen. She stared at Holt, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she clapped. 1, 2, 3 times. The sound echoed through the chamber. It was not mockery. It was acknowledgement. Perhaps, she murmured, I was too quick to judge your kind. Holt, still catching his breath, gave a small, confident smirk. That's a start. Queen Selvera was not used to losing. She sat in her private chamber, staring at the glowing projection of Commander Darius Holt, reviewing the fight from earlier. No human should have been able to defeat a Zereth warlord. Their bones were weaker, their reflexes slower, their lives shorter. And yet, Holt had stood against General Korzul, a warrior who had crushed enemies twice his size, and won. It shouldn't have been possible. And yet, it had happened. Selvera clenched her 4 fists, irritated. She should not be thinking about this. Holt was a mere human, an outsider, nothing more. His kind were unremarkable mammals, barely past their primitive wars. And yet, something about him bothered her. His eyes, that unyielding stare, the way he moved with confidence, even when surrounded by enemies. It was not Zereth strength, but something else, something dangerous. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. Her chamber doors slid open, revealing Varakesh, her most trusted advisor. The older Zereth warrior had seen many battles, and his scared exoskeleton bore the marks of war. He stepped forward, bowing slightly. My queen, he said, his deep voice steady, the human awaits your presence. Selvera narrowed her golden eyes. He is persistent. He is either a fool, Varakesh said, or he understands something we do not. Selvera exhaled slowly. This was not how she had expected this day to unfold. A human proving himself against one of her strongest warriors. It was enough to stir unrest among her court. Some saw it as a humiliation. Others saw it as a challenge to her authority. And yet here she was, preparing to meet the human alone. Moments later, she entered the royal negotiation chamber, where Holt stood, arms crossed. His dark military uniform was still dusted from the fight, and a faint bruise was forming along his jaw. But his expression was calm, his stance unwavering. Selvera studied him carefully, stepping forward with silent grace. Even with her towering height, Holt did not shrink away. "I expected you to leave after your victory," Selvera said, her voice smooth. Holt smirked and missed the chance to talk. "I thought we had an alliance to discuss." Selvera tilted her head slightly. "An alliance? You assume much." "You're still here," Holt said. "That means you're considering it." She hated how easily he saw through her. Holt stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers without fear. "Tell me something, Queen Selvera," he said. "Why did you make that challenge?" Selvera's golden eyes narrowed. "I wish to prove that humans are weak." Holt smiled. "And yet, here I am, still standing." Selvera felt an unfamiliar heat beneath her carapace, a prickle of frustration. Or something else. She had ruled for decades, had crushed rebellions, had never been questioned. And yet this human stood before her, unshaken. It was intriguing, unacceptable. She turned sharply. "Do not mistake my patience for interest, human." "Of course not," Holt said, a glint in his eyes. "I'll just assume you find me interesting." Selvera whipped around, glaring at him. Holt only grinned. The worst part. For the first time in her life, Selvera wasn't entirely sure if she disagreed. Queen Selvera had always known her duty. She was the ruler of the Zereth Dominion, a warrior queen born from the strongest lineage. Her people saw her as untouchable, unquestionable, a force of absolute power. And yet, Commander Darius Holt was testing the limits of her patience. She stood on the royal balcony, overlooking the great city of Vorkale, the beating heart of her empire. Massive dark metal towers stretched toward the sky, illuminated by the glow of crimson energy streams. Thousands of Zereth warriors moved below, their armored forms marching in perfect unity. But her attention was not on her empire. It was on the human standing beside her. Holt was quiet, his gaze studying the alien skyline. The soft wind ruffled his short brown hair, and the faint bruising on his sharp-featured face was still visible from his battle earlier. But despite the wounds, despite standing in the heart of an empire that barely tolerated his presence, he remained calm, unshaken. Selvera's golden eyes narrowed. "You have done what no human before you has ever done," she said. "You have defeated a Zereth general, earned my attention. And yet, you still refuse to act with humility." Holt smirked, his eyes flicking to hers. "Would it make a difference if I bowed?" Selvera clicked her mandibles softly, a sound of irritation. "It would show that you respect the power before you." Holt turned fully toward her now, his expression unreadable. "Respect isn't about bowing, Your Majesty. It's about standing as equals." A sharp heat flared in her chest, unexpected and unwelcome. No one spoke to her like this. And yet she did not stop him. "I do not recall granting you equality," she said coolly. Holt chuckled. "No, but you haven't denied it either." Silence stretched between them. The air was thick with something tense, electric. Selvera did not understand this man. She had faced countless diplomats before, men who groveled, men who lied, men who cowered. But Holt was something else. He challenged her without fear, met her golden gaze without submission. He fought as a warrior, but spoke as if he were her equal. It was infuriating. And yet, intriguing. She turned away, gripping the cold stone of the balcony. "The nobles whisper that you have shamed my people," she said, "that your victory was a trick, that I should have you executed." Holt stepped closer. "And what do you think?" Selvera exhaled slowly. She was not sure what she thought. She should despise him. She should see him as a threat to her empire's strength. And yet the fire in his ocean-blue eyes did not speak of weakness. It spoke of defiance, of something primal. She turned back to him. I think you are either the bravest human I have ever met." She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Holt did not move. Or the most foolish. Holt tilted his head, his smirk returning. Maybe a little of both. Selvera studied him for a long moment. Then, to her own surprise, she smiled. Just slightly. Just enough for Holt to notice. And judging by the way his expression shifted, he had. The tension in the air was undeniable. Queen Selvera had faced warlords, assassins, and traitors in her reign, yet none of them frustrated her as much as Commander Darius Holt. The human was reckless, bold, and entirely too comfortable standing before her as if they were equals. It was infuriating. And yet, it was impossible to ignore. They stood in the dimly lit war chamber, the flickering holo-projections of strategic maps floating around them. The Zereth Council had left for the night, leaving only the two of them. Selvera was still contemplating the alliance proposal Holt had brought forward, a military pact between the Zereth Dominion and humanity. A bold request, a risky one. She should have dismissed it immediately. Instead, she was considering it. Holt leaned against the edge of the war table, arms crossed. His sharp blue eyes studied her, waiting. He was patient, but there was a fire in his gaze, something that demanded an answer. Selvera exhaled slowly. "You assume I will grant you this alliance simply because you impressed me in a fight." Holt smirked. "Well, that and the fact that we'd be stronger together. Humanity has proven we don't go down easy." Selvera stepped forward, her towering form casting a shadow over him. "Strength is not about surviving. It is about conquering." Holt chuckled. "Funny. I thought it was about knowing when to fight and when to build." Selvera narrowed her golden eyes. He was too good at this game of words, of testing limits. She should not have entertained this conversation any longer. And yet, something about the way Holt stood there, unyielding in the face of a ruler feared across the galaxy, made it difficult to walk away. "Tell me, human," she said, tilting her head. "Why are you so persistent? Why risk your life to negotiate with a species that could crush your kind?" Holt's smirk faded slightly, and for the first time, his expression turned serious. "Because I know war is coming," he said. "And I think you do too." Selvera's jaw tightened. He was right. The Sithrix marauders had been pushing into the outer colonies, slaughtering everything in their path. Even the mighty Zereth Dominion could not ignore their growing presence. Alone, her empire could hold the line. But for how long? She had not expected a human to see the truth so clearly. Holt took a slow step forward. He was still so much smaller than her, weaker in every physical sense, and yet he carried himself with the confidence of a warrior who refused to kneel. "You need us," he said, "and whether you admit it or not, maybe you're starting to see that we're not as weak as you thought." Selvera felt the heat rising in her chest again, a dangerous heat. She could crush him with a single strike. She could end this conversation, reject his offer, maintain her empire's pride. And yet, she found herself stepping even closer, her golden gaze locked onto his. "The fate of my empire is not a game, Commander Holt." Her voice was a quiet warning, but there was something else beneath it, something unfamiliar, something she did not want to name. Holt's lips curled into a small, knowing smirk. "Neither is mine, Your Majesty." And for the first time in her life, Queen Selvera felt something she never thought she would. Uncertainty. Queen Selvera should have dismissed him. She should have turned and walked away, ended this dangerous conversation before it became something more. And yet she stood there, too close to Commander Darius Holt, staring into those defiant blue eyes. The air between them felt heavy, charged. It was not hatred, not rivalry, but something else. Something Selvera did not want to name. She forced herself to take a step back, folding her forearms behind her back. "You presume too much, human. Your kind is reckless. If I agree to this alliance, I will not have humanity's foolishness endangering my empire." Holt smirked, but his voice remained steady. Reckless? Maybe. But if you thought we were truly useless, we wouldn't be standing here having this conversation. Zelvera hated that he was right. She hated it even more that she had started expecting him to be right. She turned sharply and strode toward the war table. The holographic display flickered, showing a map of the galaxy, glowing red where the Sithrex marauders had begun their invasion. Their numbers were growing. Their fleet was spreading like a plague, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Zelvera knew war better than anyone, and she knew what was coming. Alone, the Zereth Dominion would hold the line. But for how long? She exhaled, tapping a clawed finger against the edge of the table. Say I accept this alliance. What do you want in return? Holt didn't hesitate. A mutual defense pact, technology sharing, and trade routes between our worlds. Zelvera narrowed her golden eyes. You ask for much. You need much. A tense silence stretched between them. Zelvera hated that he saw her struggle, not one of weakness, but of strategy, of deciding the fate of her people. No one had dared to challenge her like this. No one had stood this close and looked at her as though she were not just a queen, but a person. She turned back to face him. There will be terms, my terms. Holt shrugged. I figured. Zelvera took another step forward, watching him carefully. If I agree to this, Commander Holt, you will be under my command. I will not tolerate disobedience. Holt grinned. I don't take orders easily. Zelvera smirked, a rare expression on her usually cold face. Then this will be interesting. They stood there for a moment, studying each other, neither backing down. The tension between them was no longer just political. It was something deeper. A dangerous line had been crossed, and Zelvera knew it. But for the first time in her life, she did not care. The deal was made. The Zereth Dominion and humanity would stand together against the coming war. But that was not what consumed Queen Zelvera's thoughts. She sat in her private chamber, her golden eyes fixed on the holographic reports before her, but she wasn't reading them. Her mind kept circling back to a single moment, a moment that shouldn't have happened. Commander Darius Holt. His words, his defiance, his confidence, everything about him was wrong. He was human, weaker, shorter, different. And yet, when she stood before him, she had not felt stronger. She had felt unsteady. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. The chamber doors slid open, and before she could even order him away, Holt stepped inside. She should have been angry. No one entered without permission, but instead of rage, all she felt was a sharp electric tension. You're brave to walk in here unannounced, human, she said coolly, masking the strange heat rising in her chest. Holt smirked as he always did, unshaken, unafraid. I figured if we're allies now, we should at least talk like it, he said, stopping a few feet away. And since you've been avoiding me all day, I took the direct route. Zelvera's mandibles clicked softly, a sign of irritation. I have not been avoiding you. Holt raised an eyebrow. Really? Then let's talk. Zelvera exhaled sharply. You are reckless, and you are avoiding the truth. She whipped around, glaring at him. And what truth would that be, Commander Holt? Holt stepped closer. Too close. His blue eyes held something dangerous. Not just defiance, but something deeper, something she did not want to name. That you don't hate this as much as you pretend to, he said. Zelvera felt her four fists tighten. This human, this infuriating, impossible human. He was standing so close now that she could see the faint bruises still lingering from his fight, the way his breath was steady but controlled. He wasn't afraid of her. That should have angered her, but it didn't. She let out a slow breath. You are playing a dangerous game, human. Holt smirked. Maybe. But I think you're playing it too. Zelvera knew she should shut this down. Step away. End it here. But she didn't. For the first time in her life, Queen Selvera did not walk away from a battle she knew she was losing. Queen Selvera had always been certain of herself, her purpose, her duty. The weight of her empire rested on her shoulders, and she had never faltered, never questioned, never hesitated. Until now. Until Commander Darius Holt. She should not have let him stand so close, should not have let him challenge her with nothing but his gaze. And yet she did. They stood in the dim glow of her private chamber, the war-torn galaxy forgotten for just a moment. Holt's blue eyes held something dangerous, something Selvera had no experience resisting. He had no right to look at her like that. And worse, she had no right to want him to. Selvera's claws curled at her sides, an instinctive reaction to a fight that wasn't truly a fight at all. "This is foolish," she said, voice sharper than she intended. Holt, of course, didn't back down. "Maybe," he admitted, "but that's never stopped either of us before." Selvera's golden eyes narrowed. "He always did this." Twisted her words, turned her own strength against her. It infuriated her. It intrigued her. She should have ended this. She was the ruler of the Zereth Dominion, and he was a soldier from a species she had once considered beneath her notice. But when she looked at him, she did not see a weak human. She saw a warrior. One who had survived against impossible odds. One who had fought for respect rather than demanded it. One who had somehow, impossibly, made her question things she had never questioned before. Selvera exhaled slowly. "You are impossible, human." Holt smirked. "I get that a lot." The space between them was dangerously small now. Selvera could have stepped back. Holt could have laughed it off, turned away. Neither of them did. A decision had been made, though neither of them spoke it. Neither of them needed to. Some lines could not be uncrossed. And tonight, they would not try. Queen Selvera had faced battles that shook the stars, wars that reshaped civilizations. But nothing had prepared her for this. She stood alone in her private chamber, golden eyes locked on her reflection in the dark glass. The weight of the previous night clung to her like armor she could not remove. She had crossed a line she had never expected to cross. She turned sharply, fists clenched. This was not weakness. It could not be. She was a queen. She had ruled the Zereth Dominion with strength, with dominance. And yet, the moment replayed in her mind. The heat of Commander Darius Holt's presence, the way he had not flinched beneath her gaze, beneath her touch, the way she had not wanted him to leave. A sharp chime broke through her thoughts. The door slid open, and there he stood. Holt. His stance was relaxed, but there was something different in his eyes. A quiet storm, a tension neither of them had the words to address. For a long moment, they just stared. The air between them felt heavier than any battlefield. Finally, Holt exhaled and took a step forward. "Are you going to say anything, or are we just going to stand here pretending last night didn't happen?" Selvera's mandibles tightened. It should not have happened. Holt's smirk was faint, but there was no humor in it. And yet it did. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, unspoken consequences. Selvera could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, but she did not let it show. She was a queen. She did not regret. She did not hesitate. Yet, for the first time, she had no answer. Holt tilted his head slightly, watching her. "You're afraid." Selvera's eyes snapped to his, golden fire meeting deep blue. "I fear nothing." Holt chuckled, but there was something softer in it. Something real. "Then why are you acting like last night was a mistake?" She didn't answer. Because she didn't know. What they had done, what they had crossed into, was not just a simple night of indulgence. It was a shift. A dangerous one. The Zereth people would never understand. Her enemies would twist it into weakness. And yet, when she looked at Holt, she did not feel weak. She felt alive. Holt took another step closer. He was still so much smaller, so much more fragile. And yet, he was the only one in the entire galaxy who had ever challenged her, matched her, He stopped just before her, his voice lower now. You can run from this if you want. Pretend it didn't mean anything. Zelvera said nothing. Holt's eyes searched hers. But I won't pretend. The words struck deeper than they should have. Holt exhaled and shook his head. Your call, Your Majesty, always has been. Then, with one last lingering glance, he turned and left. Zelvera remained still long after the doors closed. Her empire needed her strength. The war loomed closer every day. But for the first time in her life, she questioned if strength meant denying what she truly wanted. And what terrified her most was that she already knew the answer.